The dust kicked up around Willa Foster's boots as she stood before the burned ruins of what had once been her father's general store, swallowing hard against the grief that threatened to consume her whole. 3 weeks had passed since influenza took both her parents within days of each other, and now the early morning fire that swept through downtown Laredo, Texas had claimed the one thing she had left of them, leaving nothing but charred timber and shattered dreams in this unforgiving summer of 1876. Behind her, the whispers started like they always did, the townspeople gathering in small clusters along Main Street, their voices carrying on the hot July wind. Mrs. Henderson clutched her reticule tighter, shaking her head with practiced sympathy that never quite reached her eyes. Mayor Pritchard stood outside his office, arms crossed, already calculating how quickly he could acquire the prime lot once Willa defaulted on the property taxes. Even Reverend Thomas, who had buried her parents just 3 weeks prior, wore an expression of resigned pity. "Poor girl doesn't stand a chance," someone murmured. "A woman alone trying to rebuild, it's impossible. She should accept Gerald Morrison's proposal and be done with it. At least she'd have security." Willa's jaw tightened. Gerald Morrison, the banker's son who had been circling like a vulture since her father's death, offering marriage with all the warmth of a business transaction. He wanted the land, not her. Everyone in Laredo seemed to think her only options were to marry desperately or leave town in disgrace. "Miss Foster." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady, cutting through the whispers like a knife through cotton. Willa turned to find Cadden Fletcher standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, dust from the trail still coating his worn leather vest. She knew him by reputation only, the quiet cowboy who worked the Patterson Ranch north of town. The one people said was honest to a fault and kept to himself. His face was weathered from years under the Texas sun, strong jaw shadowed with a day's worth of stubble, but his eyes were kind, a warm brown that reminded her of the earth after rain. He couldn't have been more than 26, maybe 27, while she had just turned 23 last month. "Mr. Fletcher," she acknowledged, uncertain why he would approach her now, when everyone else seemed content to watch her tragedy unfold from a safe distance. "I heard about the fire. I'm sorry for your loss." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the attention their conversation was drawing. "Your father sold me my first saddle when I came to Laredo 5 years ago, gave me a fair price when he could have charged double to a desperate ranch hand. He was a good man." Something in Willa's chest cracked at the simple sincerity in his words. "He was," she managed, her voice rougher than she intended. "Thank you." Cadden glanced at the ruins, then back at her, seeming to wrestle with something internal. Finally, he spoke again, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I know it's not my place, Miss Foster, but I've got some savings. Not much, but enough to help with materials if you're planning to rebuild." Willa stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Why would you do that?" "Because this town's already written you off, and that's not right." His brown eyes held her steadily. "And because sometimes people need someone to believe in them when nobody else will." Before she could respond, Gerald Morrison's voice cut across the space between them, sharp with barely concealed irritation. "Fletcher, shouldn't you be working the Patterson spread instead of bothering Miss Foster during her time of grief?" Cadden's expression didn't change, but Willa noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "Just paying my respects, Morrison. No law against that. Of course not." Gerald's smile was all teeth as he moved closer, positioning himself between Willa and Cadden with deliberate possessiveness. "Though I'm sure Miss Foster would prefer to discuss her future with people who actually have the means to help her properly." The implication hung heavy in the air. Gerald Morrison wore his wealth like armor, his pressed suit and polished boots a stark contrast to Cadden's trail-worn clothes. His pale blue eyes swept over Willa with an assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. "My future is my own to discuss," Willa said firmly, straightening her spine. "And I'll choose who I speak with, thank you." Gerald's smile tightened. "Of course. I simply meant that certain realities must be faced. This property has significant debts attached, and the bank will require payment by the end of August. Without the store's income, well, I'm sure you understand the difficult position you're in." "I understand perfectly." "Then you also understand that my offer of marriage stands. As my wife, you'd want for nothing. The property could be absorbed into my portfolio, and you'd be spared the embarrassment of foreclosure." Willa felt her temper rising, hot and fierce. "That's very generous, Gerald, but I'm not interested in being absorbed into anyone's portfolio." The smile vanished entirely from Gerald's face, replaced by cold calculation. "Pride is an expensive luxury for a woman in your position. I'd suggest you think carefully before refusing the only viable option you have." "She's got other options." Cadden's voice was quiet, but something in it made Gerald turn sharply. The cowboy stepped forward, closing the gap Gerald had created, and looked directly at Willa. "If you're serious about rebuilding, Miss Foster, I meant what I said. I'll help however I can. Labor, materials, whatever you need." "This is absurd," Gerald scoffed. "You're a ranch hand. What could you possibly offer her? An honest day's work without strings attached?" Cadden never took his eyes off Willa. "And a partner who believes she can succeed instead of someone waiting for her to fail so he can profit from it." The gathered crowd had grown silent, everyone straining to hear the exchange. Willa's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked between Gerald's red-faced indignation and Cadden's steady certainty. The smart choice, the safe choice, was probably to accept Gerald's proposal. She'd have financial security, social standing, everything her parents would have wanted for her. But she'd also have a husband who saw her as property, who was already counting the profits from her father's legacy before the ashes had cooled. She thought of her father, who had taught her to read ledgers and negotiate with suppliers, who had always said she had a better head for business than most men twice her age. She thought of her mother, who had run the household with quiet efficiency and taught Willa that a woman's strength was nothing to apologize for. They hadn't raised her to take the easy path. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the dusty street, "I accept your offer. And I'm going to rebuild my father's store, bigger and better than before." The whispers exploded around them like rifle shots. Gerald's face went from red to purple, his hands clenching at his sides. "You're making a terrible mistake, Willa. When you come crawling back, begging for my help, don't expect the same generous terms." "I won't be crawling anywhere," she replied coolly. "Good day, Mr. Morrison." He stalked away, nearly colliding with Mayor Pritchard in his haste. The mayor watched him go, then turned his calculating gaze on Willa and Cadden. "Miss Foster, I hope you understand that the property taxes are due regardless of your, shall we say, ambitious plans. The town can't make exceptions, even for tragic circumstances." "I understand, Mayor." "The taxes will be paid on time, see that they are." His tone made it clear he didn't believe her for a moment. "Come September 1st, if the debt isn't cleared, the property will go to auction." After he left, the crowd began to disperse, still whispering among themselves. Willa heard snatches of their conversations, predictions of her imminent failure, speculation about her relationship with Cadden, thinly veiled excitement at the prospect of more scandal to gossip about over Sunday dinners. When they were finally alone, or as alone as two people could be on Main Street in broad daylight, Willa turned to Cadden. Her hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to hide it. "I should probably ask you why you really offered to help me. We barely know each other." Cadden settled his hat back on his head, the shadow of the brim cutting across his face. "I told you the truth. Your father helped me when I needed it, and I believe in returning kindness. But there's more to it than that, I suppose." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've watched this town tear down anyone who doesn't fit their idea of how things should be. Watched good people give up on their dreams because everybody kept telling them they'd fail. Gets to be a pattern after a while. And you want to break the pattern. I want to see what happens when somebody doesn't give up." He met her eyes. "And I think you're strong enough to prove every single one of them wrong." Something warm unfurled in Willa's chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or determination, or something more dangerous than either. "I don't even know where to start. The insurance my father had won't cover a fraction of the losses. The suppliers in San Antonio won't extend credit without the store as collateral. And even if I could afford materials, I don't know the first thing about construction. Then we start with what we do know." Cadden gestured to the ruins. "First thing is clearing the lot. That's just labor, and I can handle that. Then we need a plan, proper blueprints, so we know exactly what materials we need and how much they'll cost. My friend Marcus works for a surveyor in San Antonio. He owes me a favor and might draw up plans for cheap. And the materials. There's a lumber operation near Austin that might work with us if we're willing to haul it ourselves. I've got connections with some of the other ranch hands. Between us, we could probably borrow enough wagons for transport." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It won't be easy and it won't be fast. But if you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked in your life, I think we can do this." Willa looked at the ruins again, really looked at them. Somewhere in that mess of charred wood and broken glass were the remains of everything her parents had built together. Every board and nail represented their dreams, their sacrifices. She could walk away, marry Gerald or leave Laredo entirely, let someone else clear this lot and build something new, or she could fight. "When can we start?" she asked. The corner of Cadden's mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "How about right now?" They worked until sunset, Cadden pulling away the larger pieces of burned timber while Willa sorted through the debris for anything salvageable. There wasn't much. A few tools with melted handles, some hardware that could be cleaned and reused, a strongbox that had protected a handful of her father's business records. But every item they rescued felt like a small victory. As the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cadden straightened from his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "You should head home, get some rest. This is going to be a long haul and you'll need your strength." Willa wanted to argue, but her muscles were already screaming in protest, and her hands were blistered despite her gloves. "What about you? I'll finish up here, make sure everything's secure for the night. Some folks in this town might see an opportunity in an unguarded lot." She hadn't thought of that, the possibility of theft or further sabotage. "You think someone might try to cause more damage? I think there are people in Laredo who have a vested interest in seeing you fail." Cadden's expression was grim. "Gerald Morrison isn't used to being told no, and the mayor's probably already calculating how much he can make off this property. We need to be careful." "We," Willa repeated softly. "You keep saying we." Cadden met her gaze, and in the fading light his eyes seemed darker, more intense. "I meant what I said, Miss Foster. We're in this together now. We'll succeed together and prove them wrong." The words settled over her like a promise, solid and real in a way that nothing else had felt since her parents died. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned toward the small boarding house where she'd been staying since the funeral. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Willa stared at the ceiling and thought about Cadden Fletcher. She barely knew him, yet he'd offered her more genuine support in one afternoon than anyone else in Laredo had provided in 3 weeks. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel less alone in a way she desperately needed. But there was danger in that comfort too. She couldn't afford to be distracted, couldn't let herself depend too heavily on someone who might wake up tomorrow and realize he'd made a mistake. People changed their minds all the time, especially when following through got difficult. She'd just have to make sure she could stand on her own, no matter what happened. The next morning, Willa arrived at the lot before sunrise to find Cadden already there, a pot of coffee brewing over a small fire and 3 other men standing beside him. She recognized them vaguely, ranch hands who sometimes came into town on Saturday nights. "Miss Foster, these are some friends from Patterson's spread," Cadden said by way of introduction. "This is James, Thomas, and Robert. They've volunteered to help with the clearing." The 3 men nodded respectfully, and James, who looked to be the oldest at perhaps 30, spoke up. "Cadden told us what you're trying to do, madam. Figure it's worth a few days of our time to help out." "I can't pay you," Willa said immediately. "I wish I could, but didn't ask for payment," Thomas interrupted, his weathered face crinkling in a smile. "Sometimes things are worth doing just because they are worth doing." By mid-morning, they'd cleared away most of the debris, and Willa had a much clearer sense of the lot's dimensions and possibilities. Cadden walked the perimeter with her, pointing out where the foundation would need reinforcement, which areas got the best light, where they should position the entrance for maximum visibility from the street. "You've thought about this a lot," she observed. "Spent some time last night sketching ideas," he admitted. "Figured if we're going to rebuild, might as well improve on the original design. Your father's store was practical, but we could make better use of the space." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, and Willa leaned closer to examine his rough drawings. Despite his claims of limited education, the sketches showed a keen understanding of structure and space. He designed a 2-story building with the store on the ground floor and living quarters above, with large windows to maximize natural light, and a covered porch that would provide shade during the brutal summer months. "This is wonderful," Willa breathed, tracing the lines with her finger. "How did you learn to do this?" Cadden shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Pick things up here and there. Helped build most of the structures on Patterson's ranch. Old Charlie, the foreman before the current one, he taught me a lot about construction before he passed." "It's more than I could have done." She looked up at him, seeing him properly for perhaps the first time. In the harsh morning light, she noticed details she'd missed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes despite his relatively young age, the way his hands, rough and calloused from years of ranch work, held the paper with surprising gentleness. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something passed between them, an awareness that made Willa's breath catch. Then Thomas called out with a question about where to stack the salvageable lumber, and the moment broke. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Cadden would arrive before dawn, often with 1 or 2 other ranch hands who could spare a few hours. Willa worked alongside them, ignoring the scandalized looks from townspeople who thought it improper for a young woman to engage in manual labor. She learned to swing a hammer, to measure and cut boards, to read the land and understand how weather and time would affect the structure they were building. Cadden proved to be a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain the why behind each decision. More than that, he listened to her ideas, incorporating her suggestions about the store's layout and design. When she proposed adding a section specifically for items women needed, things her mother had often complained were hard to find locally, he immediately adjusted the plans to accommodate it. That's smart business, he said, redrawing one of the interior walls. Half the population of Laredo is female, but most stores act like women don't exist beyond dress fabric and hairpins. Exactly. Willa felt a flush of pleasure that he understood so quickly. If we stock quality kitchen equipment, proper tools for home management, maybe even some books and educational materials, we could draw customers from smaller towns too. Women would travel for goods they can't get elsewhere. We could advertise in the regional newspapers, let people know we're different. Willa said again, echoing their earlier conversation. You keep saying that. Cadden looked up from his sketches, his expression serious. Does it bother you? No, she said honestly. No, it doesn't bother me at all. 2 weeks into the project, Marcus arrived from San Antonio with professional blueprints based on Cadden's sketches. He was a tall, thin man with ink-stained fingers and an enthusiastic manner that reminded Willa of her father. These are incredible plans, Marcus said, spreading the papers across a makeshift table. Cadden told me what you're trying to accomplish, and I have to say, I admire your courage, Miss Foster. Courage or foolishness, Willa replied with a tired smile. The jury's still out. Well, for what it's worth, I think it's courage. He pointed to various elements of the design. I've made some modifications for structural integrity, and I've included notes on the most cost-effective materials for each component. If you're careful about your purchasing and willing to do most of the labor yourselves, this is achievable. What's the estimated cost? Willa almost didn't want to know the answer. Marcus named a figure that made her stomach drop. It was less than she'd feared, but still far more than she currently had available. Even selling every piece of jewelry her mother had left her, even emptying the meager savings account her father had maintained, she'd still be several $100s short. Cadden must have seen the despair on her face because he spoke up quickly. We'll figure it out. I've been thinking about the lumber situation. If we can get to Austin ourselves, we can probably negotiate a better price by buying in bulk and arranging our own transport. That might save us $50, maybe more. And I know a metalworker in San Antonio who makes fixtures, Marcus added. He's getting older, looking to offload some inventory. Might sell to you at cost if you agree to display his maker's mark. Every bit helps, Willa murmured, already calculating in her head. If we can save enough on materials, maybe I can make it work. After Marcus left, promising to return in a few weeks to check on their progress, Cadden and Willa sat in the shade of a nearby building, sharing a simple lunch of bread and cheese. The heat was oppressive, and Willa had long since abandoned any pretense of propriety, rolling up her sleeves and pulling her hair back in a simple braid. You're thinking too loud, Cadden observed, biting into an apple. I'm thinking about money, or the lack thereof. She sighed, leaning back against the wall. Even with all the cost-cutting measures, I'm still going to come up short, and that's not even accounting for the property taxes. How much do you need? For the taxes, I mean. She told him, and he went quiet, chewing thoughtfully. Finally, he said, I've got most of that saved. I can cover it. Absolutely not. Willa sat up straight. Cadden, you've already done so much. I can't take your life savings. It's not all my savings, and it's not a gift. Consider it an investment. He met her eyes. I believe this store is going to succeed, which means you'll be able to pay me back eventually. With interest, if that makes you feel better about it. That's not the point. What if I fail? What if the store doesn't make enough profit to repay you? You won't fail. The absolute certainty in his voice made something twist in Willa's chest. You can't know that. I know you. He shifted to face her more fully. I've watched you work harder than any 3 men combined. I've seen you figure out solutions to problems that would have stopped most people cold. You're smart, determined, and you've got a vision for something better than what was here before. That's a winning combination, or a recipe for spectacular failure. Then we'll fail spectacularly together. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. But we won't fail. We're going to build something incredible here, Willa. Something that'll outlast both of us. And 20 years from now, when people talk about the Foster store, they're going to remember that everyone said it was impossible, and you did it anyway. Willa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since the day of the fire. Why do you believe in me so much? You don't even really know me. I know enough. His voice softened. I know you stood up to Gerald Morrison in front of the whole town, when taking his offer would have been easier. I know you're out here every day, working until your hands bleed, because you're not willing to give up on your parents' legacy. I know you're brave and stubborn and probably too proud for your own good. He paused. And I know that every time you smile, which isn't often enough, it feels like the sun coming out after a storm. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Willa couldn't name but felt all the way to her bones. Cadden was close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could count the individual sun-darkened freckles across his nose. Cadden, she whispered, not sure what she meant to say. I should probably tell you, he continued, his voice rough, that this stopped being just about your father's kindness about a week ago. Maybe sooner. I'm not entirely sure when it happened, but somewhere between the lumber sorting and the blueprint revisions, I started doing this for you. Because I want to see you succeed, because I want to be part of whatever you're building here, because when I'm around you, I feel like I'm part of something important. Willa's heart hammered so hard she was certain he must hear it. That sounds suspiciously like more than just a business partnership. It is more. He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. If I'm reading this wrong, tell me now, and I'll never mention it again. We'll just be business partners, and that'll be enough. And if you're not reading it wrong, then I'd like permission to court you properly. Once we're not quite so busy trying to meet impossible deadlines, I'd like to take you to dinner, maybe a dance at the town hall, all the things a woman deserves when a man is trying to win her heart. Willa had never been courted before. Her father had been protective, turning away suitors he deemed unworthy, and then the illness had come, and grief had consumed everything else. She'd certainly never felt anything like the fluttering in her stomach when Cadden looked at her with those steady brown eyes. I think, she said carefully, that I'd like that very much. But Cadden, I need you to understand something. Even if this, whatever this is between us, even if it doesn't work out, I still need your help finishing the store. I can't do this alone. You won't have to. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. If you decide tomorrow that you can't stand the sight of me, I'll still be here, hammer in hand, until this building is complete. You have my word. I don't think I could ever not stand the sight of you, Willa admitted, feeling brave and terrified all at once. Cadden's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. He leaned in gradually, still giving her time to change her mind, until his lips brushed against hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely there at all. Then he pulled back, searching her face for any sign of regret. Willa answered by closing the distance between them and kissing him properly, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. He tasted like apples and sunshine, and when his arms came around her waist, pulling her closer, she felt safer than she had since her parents died. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cadden rested his forehead against hers. We should probably get back to work before someone sees us and adds fuel to the gossip fire. Probably, Willa agreed, but neither of them moved. Eventually, necessity drove them back to the construction site, but something had fundamentally shifted. They worked in companionable silence, but now there were shared glances and small touches, his hand steadying her on a ladder, her fingers brushing his as she passed him tools. The physical labor was just as exhausting, the challenges just as daunting, but Willa felt lighter somehow, like she'd found an anchor in a storm she hadn't even realized was raging. That evening, as they packed up for the day, Gerald Morrison appeared at the edge of the lot, his expression cold. "Miss Foster, I thought you should know that I've spoken with the bank. Your property taxes have been accelerated. They'll be due by the end of this month instead of September 1st. Willa's stomach dropped. "They can't do that. There are regulations. There are also clauses for properties deemed at risk of abandonment or significant devaluation. Given the state of your lot, the bank has exercised its right to early collection." His smile was sharp as a knife. "I tried to warn you that refusing my help would have consequences." "You mean you bribed someone at the bank to change the terms?" Cadden's voice was dangerously quiet. "I mean I advised them of the financial reality of the situation. What they chose to do with that information is their business." Gerald's pale eyes fixed on Willa. "You have 2 weeks, Miss Foster. 2 weeks to come up with the full amount or this property goes to auction. And I promise you I'll be the highest bidder." After he left, Willa sank down onto a pile of lumber, all the air gone from her lungs. 2 weeks. It was impossible. They'd barely finished clearing the lot, and now she had to come up with money she didn't have in a fraction of the time she'd planned for. "Hey." Cadden crouched in front of her, taking her hands. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, feeling defeated for the first time since they'd started this project. "We're not giving up," he said firmly. "Morrison's trying to break you, but he doesn't understand what he's up against. We'll get the money." "How? Even with your savings, we're still short." "Then we find another way." He squeezed her hands. "Tomorrow we take a trip to Austin, talk to that lumber supplier about an advance sale on materials. If we can convince them we're a good investment, maybe they'll front us enough to cover the gap." "Why would they do that?" "Because we're going to show them the blueprints, the business plan, everything that proves this isn't just a desperate gamble. We're going to make them believe in us the way I believe in us." He pulled her to her feet. "Get some rest tonight. We leave at first light." The ride to Austin took most of the next day, the July heat brutal even in the early morning. Cadden had borrowed a wagon from Patterson's ranch, promising his boss he'd work extra hours to make up for the time away. They shared the bench seat, their shoulders touching with each bump in the road, talking about everything and nothing to pass the time. Willa learned that Cadden had come to Texas from Missouri after his mother died, looking for a fresh start away from memories that hurt too much. He'd worked odd jobs for a year before landing at Patterson's ranch, slowly building a reputation as reliable and skilled. He sent money every month to his younger sister back in Missouri, helping her finish school. In return, she told him about growing up in the store, learning inventory management before she learned to read, the way her father had always treated her like an equal partner despite her age. She talked about her mother's quiet strength, the way she'd held the family together through good times and bad, teaching Willa that grace and determination weren't mutually exclusive. By the time they reached Austin, Willa felt like she'd known Cadden for years instead of weeks. There was an ease between them that she'd never experienced with anyone else, a sense that they understood each other on some fundamental level that transcended words. The lumber operation was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of warehouses and sawmills. The owner, a gruff man named Samuel Hart, listened to their pitch with skepticism clearly written across his face. "Let me understand this correctly," he said when they'd finished. You want me to not only sell you lumber at cost, but also defer payment until after your store is profitable enough to pay me back. Yes, sir, Willa said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I know it's a significant risk, but I believe the potential reward is worth it. The potential reward for you, maybe. What do I get out of this besides an uncertain promissory note? Exclusive supplier status, Cadden interjected. Once Miss Foster's store is established, she'll need regular shipments of lumber and building materials to sell to customers throughout the region. You'd be her sole provider, with standing orders that would provide consistent business for years. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying them both. You're asking me to gamble on two young people I've never met, in a town 3 days' ride from here, based on nothing but optimism and a few pretty blueprints. No, sir, Willa corrected. We're asking you to invest in a solid business plan backed by determination and hard work. And we're offering you not just repayment, but an ongoing business relationship that could be profitable for both of us. What makes you think your store will succeed when so many others fail? Because I'm not trying to run the same store everyone else runs. Willa pulled out the detailed inventory lists she'd been working on, the market analysis she'd compiled by talking to women throughout Laredo about what they needed but couldn't get locally. I'm targeting an underserved market with products that have consistent demand. I've already secured commitments from 3 dozen women who'll shop there regularly once we open. That's guaranteed baseline revenue. Samuel examined her documents, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to interest. You put all this together yourself. My father taught me well, clearly. He set the papers down, then looked at Cadden. What about you? What's your stake in this? I'm Miss Foster's partner in the construction and future operations. I'll be handling facilities maintenance and expansion as the business grows. You a carpenter by trade, ranch hand by necessity, carpenter by inclination. I've built most of the structures on the Patterson spread over the past 5 years. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered fingers drumming on the desk. Finally, he said, I'll make you a deal. I'll provide the lumber and materials you need at cost, with payment deferred for 6 months. That gives you time to build, open, and start generating revenue. But I want 15% interest on the deferred amount, and I want the exclusive supplier contract Miss Foster mentioned, locked in for 5 years minimum. Willa's mind raced, calculating. 15% was high but not unreasonable given the risk Samuel was taking. And 5 years of exclusive supply was a small price to pay for the opportunity to actually build her store. Can we negotiate the interest down to 12% if I agree to 7 years exclusive? A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. Your father really did teach you well. Fine. 12%, 7 years exclusive, payment deferred 6 months from delivery of materials. We have a deal. They shook hands, and Willa felt like she could breathe properly for the first time in days. They still had to come up with the property tax money, but at least now they had the materials secured. It was one impossible problem solved. On the ride back to Laredo, as the sun set in spectacular shades of orange and purple, Cadden reached over and took Willa's hand. You were incredible in there. The way you negotiated with Samuel, you had him eating out of your hand by the end. We had him eating out of our hand, she corrected. That bit about exclusive supplier status was brilliant. I wouldn't have thought of it. We make a good team. We do. She squeezed his hand, marveling at how natural it felt. A few weeks ago, she'd been completely alone, drowning in grief and fear. Now she had a partner, someone who believed in her vision and was willing to risk everything to help her achieve it, someone she was rapidly falling in love with. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt right, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. She glanced at Cadden's profile, strong and steady in the fading light, and wondered if he felt it too, this pull between them that grew stronger every day. As if sensing her gaze, he turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Willa, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. The wagon rattled on, but Willa felt like time had stopped, like the whole world had narrowed to just the two of them and this moment. "I know it's too soon," Cadden continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we've only known each other a few weeks, and we're in the middle of this impossible project, and you probably think I'm crazy. But I need you to know, before anything else happens, that this is real for me. You're not just a business partner or a friend. You're the person I want to build a life with if you'll have me." Willa's heart felt too big for her chest. "You're not crazy. Or maybe we both are, because I love you too. I think I have since that first day when you stood up to Gerald Morrison and told me we'd succeed together." Cadden pulled the wagon to a stop, not caring that they were still an hour from Laredo, and cupped her face in his hands. "Say that again." "I love you," Willa whispered. "I love you, and it terrifies me, and I don't care." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, pouring everything he felt into it. Willa wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with equal fervor, all the fear and hope and love she'd been holding inside spilling over. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cadden rested his forehead against hers. "When this is all over, when the store is built and thriving, I'm going to marry you, Willa Foster. If you'll have me." That sounds suspiciously like a proposal. It's a statement of intent. "The actual proposal will be much more romantic, I promise." Willa laughed, the sound bright and free in the darkening evening. "I'll hold you to that." They made it back to Laredo near midnight, exhausted but hopeful. Cadden walked Willa to the boarding house, kissing her good night on the porch despite the impropriety, neither of them caring who might see. The next morning brought new challenges. The property taxes were still due in less than 2 weeks, and even with Cadden's savings and the lumber deal secured, they were still several $100s short. Willa spent the morning going through every possible asset she had, every item she could sell, but it wasn't enough. She was sitting at the lot, staring at the numbers in her ledger for the 100th time, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Foster." Willa looked up to find Mrs. Henderson standing at the edge of the property, looking uncomfortable. The older woman clutched her reticule and wouldn't quite meet Willa's eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, can I help you with something?" "I hope so. That is, I hope I can help you." Mrs. Henderson took a few steps closer. "I heard about your tax situation. The whole town's been talking about how Gerald Morrison manipulated the bank to move up your deadline." "Yes, well, I'm managing." Willa tried to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "That's just it. You shouldn't have to manage alone." Mrs. Henderson finally looked at her directly. "Your mother was kind to me when my husband died 5 years ago. Everyone else in this town treated me like I'd become invisible overnight, but your mother, she still invited me to tea, still asked my opinion on things, still made me feel like I mattered. My mother was a good woman. She was. And she raised a good daughter." Mrs. Henderson pulled an envelope from her reticule. "I want to invest in your store. Not a loan, an investment. I have some money from my late husband's estate that's just sitting in the bank earning minimal interest. I'd rather put it to use helping someone who deserves a chance." Willa stared at the envelope, almost afraid to touch it. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't accept charity. It's not charity, it's business. I want a 5% stake in your store's profits for the next 10 years in exchange for this investment. Your business plan suggests that will be considerably more profitable than leaving my money in the bank. You've seen my business plan. Marcus showed it to me when he was in town last week. That young man talks when he's had a few drinks. Mrs. Henderson smiled slightly. He was very impressed with you, said you had the sharpest business mind he'd seen in years. Willa opened the envelope with shaking hands and nearly dropped it when she saw the amount. It was enough to cover the gap in her property taxes with some left over. This is too much. It's exactly enough. Take it, Willa. Build something wonderful and prove everyone in this narrow-minded town wrong about what a woman can accomplish. Tears blurred Willa's vision as she stood and impulsively hugged the older woman. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank me by succeeding. Mrs. Henderson patted her back awkwardly. Now, I should go before people start gossiping about me too, though I suspect it's already too late for that. After she left, Willa just stood there, holding the envelope and feeling like the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders. They could pay the taxes. They could actually do this. Cadden arrived an hour later with Thomas and James, ready to start framing the foundation, and Willa practically flew at him with the news. He caught her as she threw her arms around him, laughing at her enthusiasm. Mrs. Henderson invested, he repeated, disbelief clear in his voice. The same Mrs. Henderson who's friends with Mayor Pritchard's wife, the very same. She wants a 5% stake in profits for 10 years. That's more than fair. Willa, it means we won, she finished, grinning up at him. We actually have everything we need. The taxes, the materials, everything. Cadden swept her up and spun her around, not caring that Thomas and James were watching with matching grins. When he set her down, he kissed her soundly, to the accompaniment of his friends' good-natured cheering. All right, you two, James called out. Save the celebrating for after we've actually built something. We've got work to do. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. With the tax deadline looming, Willa made a very public trip to the bank, Gerald Morrison watching with barely concealed fury as she paid the full amount owed. Mayor Pritchard looked equally disappointed, his plans to acquire the property at auction thoroughly thwarted. You've bought yourself some time, Gerald said coldly as she left the bank. But time doesn't build buildings, Miss Foster. You'll still fail eventually. We'll see about that, Willa replied, walking past him with her head held high. With the taxes secured, they could finally focus entirely on construction. The lumber from Austin arrived in a convoy of wagons, Samuel Hart himself accompanying the delivery to ensure everything was in order. He walked the lot with Cadden, discussing the finer points of the construction plan, and seemed impressed by the progress they'd already made. You've got a solid foundation here, Samuel observed, and Fletcher knows what he's doing. You might actually pull this off. We will pull it off, Willa corrected firmly. Samuel laughed. I believe you. In fact, I'm going to do something I almost never do. I'm going to tell my business associates in Austin about your store. Once you're open, you might find yourself with more wholesale customers than you expected. It was an unexpected gift, the kind of word-of-mouth recommendation that could make the difference between modest success and genuine prosperity. Willa thanked him profusely, already imagining the possibilities. As summer gave way to early fall, the building began to take shape. The frame went up first, strong beams that would support 2 full stories. The exterior walls came next, and then the roof, each piece fitted carefully into place under Cadden's expert supervision. Willa worked alongside the men, her hands growing calloused and strong, her skin bronzed by the Texas sun. She learned to read a level, to calculate load-bearing requirements, to anticipate problems before they became crises. More than that, she learned to trust herself and her abilities in a way she never had before. The town watched their progress with mixed reactions. Some, like Mrs. Henderson, began to believe that Willa might actually succeed. Others remained convinced it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Gerald Morrison stopped by periodically, always with some snide comment about structural integrity or financial irresponsibility, but his words had lost their sting. Every day the building grew more solid, and every day it became harder to deny that something remarkable was happening on Main Street. Willa and Cadden's relationship deepened alongside the construction. They stole moments together when they could, sitting on the unfinished porch as the sun set, talking about their dreams for the future. Cadden had moved beyond just thinking about the store and started planning a life together, talking about the house they'd build someday, the family they'd raise. "How many children do you want?" he asked one evening, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge. "I haven't really thought about it," Willa admitted. "3, maybe. Enough for a proper family, but not so many I can't give them all attention. 3 sounds perfect." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "2 boys and a girl, or maybe 2 girls and a boy. As long as they're healthy and happy, I don't much care. You're very sure of this, of us, aren't you?" Willa thought about it, really considered the question. A few months ago, she'd been drowning in grief and uncertainty, convinced she was going to lose everything. Now she was building something extraordinary with a man who loved her unconditionally, who believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm sure." By late September, the exterior of the building was complete, and they began work on the interior. This was the part Willa had been most looking forward to, transforming empty space into the vision she'd been carrying in her head for months. She designed the main floor with wide aisles and plenty of natural light, sectioning off areas for different types of merchandise. The women's section that had been her idea took up nearly a third of the floor space, stocked with everything from quality cooking equipment to books on household management to the kind of practical tools women needed but rarely found in traditional stores. The second floor would be living quarters, at least initially. Eventually, if the business grew as she hoped, they could convert it to additional retail space or offices and build a separate residence. But for now, it made sense to live above the store, saving money and allowing her to keep a close eye on inventory and security. Cadden built her a beautiful counter for the front of the store, smooth, polished wood with intricate carvings along the edges. It was a labor of love, something he worked on in the evenings after everyone else had gone home, and when he finally revealed it to her, Willa cried. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her hands over the smooth surface. "Cadden, this must have taken hours." "It did, but you're worth it." He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Every hour, every splinter, every moment of back pain, it's all worth it to see you happy." She turned in his arms, rising on her toes to kiss him. I love you too." His expression grew serious. "Willa, I know I said I'd wait until after the store was finished to propose properly, but I don't want to wait anymore. I don't need romance or perfect timing. I just need you." Her heart began to race. "Cadden," he released her and dropped to one knee right there in the unfinished store, taking her hand in his. "Willa Foster, you're the strongest, smartest, most incredible woman I've ever met. You've challenged me to be better, to dream bigger, to believe that impossible things can come true. I want to spend the rest of my life building dreams with you, whatever form they take. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Willa said without hesitation, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, absolutely yes." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in a circle. When he finally set her down, they were both laughing breathlessly. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted. "I wanted to wait until I could afford something worthy of you. I don't need a ring, I just need you." Willa cupped his face in her hands. We'll succeed together, remember. In business and in everything else. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Marcus, Mrs. Henderson, and a handful of Cadden's friends from the ranch in attendance. Most of the town stayed away, still skeptical of the match and the business venture, but Willa didn't care. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Cadden had picked himself that morning. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and Cadden kissed her in front of God and everyone, Willa felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. This was right. This was what her parents would have wanted for her, a partnership built on love and mutual respect. The store opened in mid-October, right as they'd planned. The grand opening drew a surprisingly large crowd, curiosity overcoming skepticism for at least one day. Willa had stocked the shelves carefully, using every connection she'd made over the past months to source quality goods at reasonable prices. The women's section was an immediate hit. Customers from Laredo and surrounding towns flocked to see the selection of items they'd never been able to purchase locally. Within the first week, Willa had to place additional orders for several products that sold out almost immediately. The general merchandise moved well too, and Cadden's suggestion to include a small selection of ranch supplies proved prescient. Cowboys and ranch hands from all over the region started stopping by, drawn by competitive prices and the novelty of dealing with a woman who actually knew what she was talking about. Gerald Morrison came by on the third day, his expression carefully neutral as he browsed the aisles. Willa watched him from behind her beautiful counter, waiting for whatever cutting remark he'd prepared. "I have to admit," he said finally, approaching the counter, "this is more impressive than I anticipated. You've done well, Mrs. Fletcher." "Thank you." Willa kept her voice polite but cool. "I underestimated you. That was my mistake." He set a small item on the counter, a tin of boot polish. "I'm not apologizing exactly, but I am acknowledging that I was wrong about your chances of success." It wasn't much, but coming from Gerald Morrison, it was practically a declaration of surrender. Willa rang up his purchase with professional efficiency, and he left without further comment. That night, lying in bed in the apartment above the store, Willa told Cadden about the encounter. He laughed, pulling her closer against his side. "Guess we proved them all wrong," he murmured into her hair. "We did. Together, just like you said." The first year of marriage and business ownership was everything Willa could have hoped for and harder than she'd imagined. They worked dawn to dusk most days, managing inventory, serving customers, handling the countless small crises that came with running a business. Money was tight at first as they paid back their loans and built up operating capital, but slowly, steadily, the store became profitable. True to his word, Samuel Hart referred several wholesale customers their way, and Willa's reputation for fair dealing and quality merchandise spread throughout the region. By their first anniversary, they were not only solvent but actually prosperous, with enough savings that Willa could finally breathe easy. Cadden continued to work part-time at Patterson's ranch, unwilling to leave his boss in the lurch, but he spent most of his time at the store, handling deliveries and maintenance and gradually taking on more of the business operations as Willa taught him everything her father had taught her. They were a true partnership in every sense, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating victories together. When Willa discovered she was pregnant in the spring of 1878, Cadden's joy was so profound it brought tears to both their eyes. Their son was born in December of that year, a healthy boy with Cadden's brown eyes and Willa's determined chin. They named him Thomas, after Willa's father, and Mrs. Henderson cried when they asked her to be his godmother. The town that had once expected Willa to fail now pointed to her as an example of what determination could accomplish. Young women came to her for advice on starting their own businesses. Mothers brought their daughters to the store, telling them to watch how Mrs. Fletcher handled herself, to learn what a woman could achieve. It was gratifying and overwhelming and sometimes exhausting, but Willa never regretted her choice. Every day she worked in the store her parents had originally built, now transformed into something even better. She felt their presence and approval. When Thomas was 6 months old, Willa hired her first employee, a young woman named Sarah who reminded her of herself at that age, smart and ambitious, but limited by the expectations of her time. Training Sarah brought its own satisfaction, teaching another woman the skills she'd need to succeed in a world that often told women they couldn't. Cadden proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, insisting on taking his share of the late-night feedings and diaper changes. Willa would sometimes watch him with their son, playing on the floor of their apartment after the store closed, and feel so much love she thought her heart might burst. Their second child, a daughter named Margaret after Willa's mother, was born in the fall of 1880. She was a tiny thing, all dark curls and serious expressions, and she had both her parents wrapped around her little finger from day one. By then, the store was thriving beyond Willa's initial dreams. They'd expanded twice, first taking over the adjacent lot when old Mr. Peterson retired and sold his cobbler shop, then building a third story that housed additional storage and office space. Sarah had been promoted to assistant manager, and they'd hired 3 more employees to handle the increased customer volume. The debt to Samuel Hart was paid off, as was Mrs. Henderson's initial investment, though she remained involved in the business as an unofficial advisor. Gerald Morrison had moved to Dallas, his influence in Laredo having waned considerably after several of his business ventures failed. Mayor Pritchard was voted out of office after a scandal involving misappropriated town funds. The people who had expected Willa to fail either apologized or stayed silent, but either way, they could no longer deny what she'd accomplished. The Foster Fletcher General Store was now the most successful business in Laredo, employing a dozen people and serving customers from across Texas. Through it all, Willa and Cadden's love never wavered. They had their disagreements, of course, the normal conflicts that came with running a business and raising children and managing all the complexities of life. But they always came back to the foundation they'd built from the beginning, that absolute certainty that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. On their 5th anniversary, Cadden took Willa on a rare evening away from the store and children, riding out to a spot north of town where wildflowers bloomed in spectacular profusion. They spread a blanket and watched the sunset, content just to be alone together. "You ever regret it?" Willa asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Taking a chance on me that day. Your life would be simpler if you just stayed a ranch hand and married someone without half the town betting on her failure." Cadden was quiet for a moment, then tilted her chin up so he could look in her eyes. "Willa, loving you and building this life with you is the best decision I've ever made. Every challenge we've faced, we've overcome together. Every success we've had means more because we achieved it together. I wouldn't change a single moment. Not even the time I accidentally ordered 100 pounds of pepper instead of 10, and we spent 3 days sneezing," he laughed, that warm sound she'd loved from the beginning. "Not even then. Though I admit, I was less fond of you during the great pepper incident." She swatted his arm playfully, then sobered. "I love you. I don't say it enough because we're always so busy, but I love you more than I ever thought possible. You stood by me when everyone else expected me to fail. You believed in me before I believed in myself." "We stood by each other," Cadden corrected. "And we succeeded together, exactly like I promised we would." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something extraordinary out of determination, love, and stubborn refusal to accept failure. Their third child, another boy they named Cadden Jr., was born in 1882. By then, they'd built the house Cadden had dreamed about, a sprawling place on the edge of town with enough room for their growing family and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the stars. The store remained their joint venture, though as the children grew, they adjusted their schedules to ensure someone was always home. Cadden took on more of the day-to-day management, proving himself as skilled at business as he was at construction, while Willa focused on strategic planning and expansion. They opened a second location in a town 50 miles west in 1884, then a third in 1886. The Foster Fletcher name became synonymous with quality and fair dealing throughout Texas. Young entrepreneurs came to them for advice, and Willa never turned anyone away, remembering how desperately she'd needed help once upon a time. Sarah eventually left to start her own business in San Antonio, using everything Willa had taught her. They remained close friends, writing letters regularly and visiting when they could. Mrs. Henderson lived to see her 81st birthday, passing peacefully in her sleep, with the satisfaction of knowing she'd invested in something truly worthwhile. As the years passed and their children grew, Willa and Cadden remained each other's favorite person, still finding moments to steal away and just be together. They'd weathered storms literal and figurative, supported each other through loss and celebrated each other's triumphs, and through it all, their love only deepened. On a warm evening in the spring of 1895, when Thomas was 17 and already showing signs of his mother's business acumen, Margaret was 15 and determinedly independent, and young Cadden was 13 and fascinated by the construction projects constantly happening around their growing business empire. Willa and Cadden sat on their porch and reflected on the life they'd built. "Do you remember that first day?" Willa asked, her hand in his just like always. "When you told me we'd succeed together and prove them wrong. I remember everything about that day." Cadden's thumb traced circles on her palm, a familiar comfort after nearly 20 years together. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met, standing there in front of those ruins, refusing to give up even though the whole town expected you to. I was terrified. You were magnificent." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You still are." Willa smiled, watching the sunset paint their town in shades of gold. The store that had started as an impossible dream now anchored Main Street, a testament to what could be accomplished with determination and love, and the unwavering support of a true partner. "We did prove them wrong," she said softly. "We did more than that." Cadden pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling completely at peace. "We built something that'll outlast us both. Our children will carry it forward and their children after them." The Foster Fletcher legacy isn't just about business success. It's about never giving up, about standing by the people you love, about proving that anything's possible when two people work together toward a common dream. "That's very profound for a cowboy," Willa teased. "I'm a businessman now, remember. We're supposed to be profound." She laughed, and he joined in, and somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear their children's voices, arguing over something inconsequential, alive and healthy and full of potential. This was what success looked like, Willa thought. Not just the thriving business or the financial security, though those were certainly blessings. Real success was measured in love given and received, in children raised to be kind and strong, in a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. The town had expected her to fail. She'd been a young woman alone, facing impossible odds, with everyone predicting her imminent defeat. But Cadden had stood firm, offering not just help but unwavering belief in her potential. Together, they'd accomplished what neither could have done alone, building not just a store but a life, a family, a legacy. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Willa thought about that frightened young woman standing before the ruins of her father's store, and wished she could tell her not to be afraid. Wished she could promise her that everything would work out better than she'd ever dreamed, that she'd find love and partnership and success beyond her wildest imaginings. But maybe that younger version of herself already knew. Maybe that was why she'd said yes when Cadden offered his help, why she'd chosen to fight instead of surrendering to the town's low expectations. Maybe she'd already understood what Willa knew now with absolute certainty, that sometimes the most important thing was simply refusing to give up, even when failure seemed inevitable. "What are you thinking about?" Cadden asked, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "How grateful I am. For you, for our children, for this life we've built, for every moment that led us here." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Me too. Every single moment." Years continued to pass, bringing their own joys and challenges. Thomas took over day-to-day management of the main store when he turned 23, showing the same business acumen his mother possessed. Margaret, true to her independent nature, became a teacher, using her position to encourage young women to pursue education and professional opportunities. Young Cadden, after studying engineering, revolutionized their storage and distribution systems, making their business even more efficient. Willa and Cadden gradually stepped back from active management, transitioning into advisory roles, while their children proved more than capable of carrying the business forward. They traveled some, visiting the places they'd only read about, but they always came back to Laredo, to the town where they'd built their dreams. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1903, the town threw them a celebration. Nearly everyone in Laredo attended, along with people from miles around whose lives had been touched by the Foster Fletcher family's generosity and business practices. Speeches were given, praising their contribution to the community and their example of what determination and partnership could accomplish. Gerald Morrison, back in town briefly to settle his late father's estate, approached them at the celebration. He was grayer now, worn down by years of failed ventures and poor choices. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Both of you. I was cruel and vindictive, and I tried to destroy you out of nothing more than spite and greed." Willa exchanged a glance with Cadden, then said, "We've long since moved past it, Gerald, but thank you for saying so. I've watched what you built here, and I realize now that I could never have created something like this. It takes more than money or ambition. It takes character, and that's something I was sorely lacking." He offered his hand to Cadden. "You're a lucky man, Fletcher." "I know," Cadden replied, shaking his hand. "Every single day I know." After Gerald left, Willa leaned into her husband's side, surveying the party thrown in their honor. Their children were there with families of their own now, grandchildren running around the decorated hall. Friends and business associates from across Texas had come to celebrate. The store that had started as an impossible dream was now an institution, employing dozens of people and serving as an anchor for Laredo's prosperity. "We did it," she whispered. "We did," Cadden agreed, his arm around her waist. "Together, just like I always knew we would." They danced that night like they had at their wedding, Cadden guiding her around the floor with the same gentle certainty he'd shown in everything they'd built together. And when the celebration ended and they returned home to the house they'd built, surrounded by reminders of a life well lived, Willa felt nothing but profound gratitude. She'd been given a precious gift that day when Cadden Fletcher approached her in the ruins of her father's store. Not just help with an impossible task, but a true partner who believed in her potential when no one else did. Together, they'd taken something broken and built it into something beautiful, proving that success wasn't about what others expected but about what two determined people could accomplish when they worked together toward a common dream. The years that followed were gentler, focused on grandchildren and community involvement rather than the frantic pace of building a business empire. Willa and Cadden spent their days doing the things they'd always meant to, but never had time for. Long rides through the countryside, afternoons reading on the porch, quiet evenings just enjoying each other's company. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, surrounded by 3 generations of family. Thomas was now a grandfather himself. Margaret had retired from teaching after touching hundreds of young lives, and young Cadden's innovations had made the Foster-Fletcher supply chain one of the most efficient in the entire Southwest. That evening, sitting on their porch one more time, Willa took Cadden's weathered hand in hers. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by age but still sharp-minded and deeply in love. "I've been thinking about that first day," she said. "When you told me we'd succeed together and prove them wrong. Did you really believe it then, or were you just trying to make me feel better?" Cadden was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing its familiar pattern on her palm. "I believed it. Maybe not in the specific details of how successful we'd become, but I believed in you. I saw your strength and determination, and I knew that if anyone could defy expectations, it would be you." Willa corrected gently. "If anyone could defy expectations, it would be us. I couldn't have done any of it without you. We were always better together." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss there just like he'd done thousands of times before. "That was the real success, Willa, not the stores or the money or the reputation. It was finding each other and building a life based on love and respect and partnership. Everything else was just a bonus." Tears pricked at Willa's eyes. "I love you. I've loved you since the day you stood up for me in front of the whole town. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. And I'll love you just as long." Cadden pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, watching the familiar sunset paint their town in gold. They sat there as the stars emerged, 2 people who had defied expectations and built something extraordinary, who had loved each other through triumph and challenge, who had proven that sometimes the most impossible dreams were the ones most worth pursuing. The town had expected her to fail. A cowboy had stood firm, offering partnership and unwavering belief. Together, they'd succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination, building not just a business but a legacy of determination, love, and the absolute certainty that anything was possible when 2 people worked together toward a common dream. As darkness fell, and the last light faded from the sky, Willa Foster Fletcher closed her eyes, her hand still clasped in Cadden's, and knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single moment of the life they'd built together. Every challenge had been worth it, every triumph sweeter for being shared, every day a gift because she'd spent it with the man who had believed in her when no one else would. They'd proven them all wrong together, just like he'd promised they would. And in doing so, they'd found something more valuable than success or wealth or vindication. They'd found a love that would endure long after the stores were gone, long after their names faded from memory, long after everything they'd built turned to dust. They'd found each other, and that made them the richest people in Texas, whether anyone else realized it or not. The end.